The winter of 1892 had arrived early in Black Hollow, Missouri. It was the kind of cold that did not simply bite. It settled into the bones of the old Appalachian ridgeline and stayed there, patient and indifferent, like a debt that had never been paid. The dirt road leading into the settlement was barely visible beneath a thin crust of frost, and the pines along the slope stood rigid and silent. Their branches bowed under the weight of ice that had formed overnight and showed no intention of melting. Elias Drummond rode in from the east just past noon, his coat collar turned up against the wind, his breath rising in pale, ragged clouds before him. He was 31 years old, lean, deliberate, and quiet in the way that men who spent more time observing than speaking tended to be. He worked as a county investigator out of Jefferson City. Not a sheriff, not a deputy, but something harder to define and easier to ignore. A man sent in when the official channels had already failed, or more precisely, when the official channels had decided, collectively and without discussion, that they preferred not to look too closely. His assignment was straightforward on paper. 3 unexplained deaths in Black Hollow over the past 14 months. A farmer named Josiah Holt, found at the base of a ravine on his own property with injuries that the county physician had described as consistent with a fall, though the precise circumstances remain unclear. A young woman named Clara Fitch, discovered unresponsive in her home by her husband, cause of death listed as cardiac episode, a determination made quickly, without thorough examination, by a local doctor who had since relocated to another county. And most recently, a schoolteacher named Robert Pruitt, whose frozen body had been found 2 miles north of the settlement, in the woods, far from any road or path that a reasonable man would have reason to walk in the middle of a November night. 3 deaths, 14 months, no arrests, no formal inquests, no serious investigation of any kind. Elias had read the files 3 times on the train from Jefferson City and found them remarkable, not for what they contained, but for what they didn't. There were no witness statements, no accounts of the victim's last known movements, no documentation of who had found each body, when, or under what circumstances. The files were thin in the particular way that files become thin when someone has made a quiet, deliberate decision to keep them that way. He dismounted in front of the town's only tavern, a low, dark building with a hand-painted sign above the door that read, "Gideon's," and tied his horse to the post. The street around him was nearly empty. A pair of older men sat on a bench outside the general store, watching him with the unhurried attention of people who had very little to do and had elevated observation into something close to a discipline. A child ran across the road between 2 houses and disappeared. Somewhere further up the street, a door closed. Before Elias could push through the tavern door, he stopped. Across the road, standing at the mouth of a narrow lane between 2 weathered buildings, a woman was watching him. She was perhaps 60 years old, dressed entirely in black from her high collar to the hem of her coat, her grey hair pulled back with severe precision beneath a dark bonnet. She stood completely still, her hands at her sides, her expression neither hostile nor welcoming, simply present, measuring, with the unhurried patience of someone who had seen many men arrive in Black Hollow and had watched most of them leave without understanding what they had come to find. Elias held her gaze for a moment. She did not look away. She did not move. Then, with the calm economy of someone who had made whatever assessment she needed to make, she turned and walked down the lane and disappeared from view. Elias stood there a moment longer, watching the empty space where she had been. Then he pushed open the door to Gideon's. The conversation inside the tavern stopped the instant he stepped through the door. 5 men sat at various tables. Farmers, by the look of their hands and their boots, men who worked land and carried the weight of it in their posture. The barkeeper, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a thick grey beard and careful eyes, set down the glass he had been polishing and waited. The silence in the room was not the silence of an empty place. It was the silence of a place where people had been talking and had, in a single shared reflex, decided to stop. Elias crossed to the bar and placed his county identification on the worn wooden surface. "Elias Drummond," he said. "County investigator. I'm here about the 3 deaths." The barkeeper looked at the identification. He looked at Elias. He glanced briefly, almost imperceptibly, at the men behind him. Then he looked back at the identification as though it were a document in a language he could read but preferred not to acknowledge. "Owen Tate," the man said at last. "I run this place." He did not offer his hand. "You'll be wanting a room." "I will, and I'll need to speak with people. Anyone who knew the deceased, anyone who can account for what happened." Owen Tate picked up his glass and resumed polishing it. "People here don't talk much to strangers." "I've found that's usually true of places where something has gone wrong," Elias said, without sharpness, as a simple observation. He settled onto a stool and rested his forearms on the bar. The woman across the street, black dress, grey hair, standing at the lane when I arrived. Who is she? The glass was set down, picked up, set down again. "That's Maren Voss," Owen said, his voice dropping half a register without apparent intention. "She lives up on the North Ridge, has for 30 years, near enough." "Is she connected to any of the deaths?" The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Elias felt the men behind him shift without turning to look. Owen Tate placed both hands flat on the bar and looked at Elias with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was very tired. "Maren Voss," he said quietly, "is connected to everything in this town. Every good thing and every terrible thing that has happened here in the last 30 years runs back to her, one way or another. Whether any of us will say so out loud is a different matter entirely." He poured a glass of water without being asked and slid it across the bar. "Get settled," he said. "You're going to need more than one night." Elias spent the remainder of the afternoon on foot, moving through Black Hollow's single main street with the methodical patience that his work required. The settlement was not large, perhaps 40 families in total, clustered along a half-mile stretch of road that ran between the mill to the south and the church to the north, with the schoolhouse sitting empty and cold at the eastern end, its door padlocked, since Robert Pruitt's death 2 months prior. He noted the details that didn't announce themselves. The mill operating at a fraction of its apparent capacity. Several houses with their shutters drawn despite the daylight. A tension in the way people move through the street, not the tension of fear exactly, but of long-standing vigilance, the posture of people who had learned to keep their heads down not as a gesture of submission, but as a survival strategy refined over decades. At the general store, he bought tobacco he didn't need and allowed Percy Gill, the owner, a nervous, talkative man in his 40s who seemed starved for conversation that didn't carry a social cost, to talk at his own pace. Percy had a habit of approaching difficult subjects from a considerable distance, circling them through layers of local gossip and weather commentary before arriving anywhere near the point. Elias let him circle. "Josiah Holt was a good man," Percy said at one point, straightening a shelf that didn't need straightening. "Kept to himself, didn't bother anyone." "Did anyone bother him?" Elias asked. Percy's hand stilled on the shelf. "His land," he said carefully, "bordered the North Ridge. There'd been a dispute about it, about the boundary. With Maren Voss? With the Calloways." Percy turned to face him. "The Calloways," he explained, in the same circling, cautious manner, were the most prominent family in the region. 3 brothers, Gerald, the eldest, who ran the mill and held most of the commercial interests in Black Hollow, Harrison, who sat on the County Land Commission, and Thomas, the youngest, whose wife Clara had been the second person to die. They were not cruel men in any obvious way, Percy was careful to say. They were simply men who had accumulated a great deal and had grown accustomed to the assumption that what they wanted, they would eventually have. And Maren Voss, Elias pressed. Percy was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the pines on the ridge with a sound like breathing. Maren Voss was here before the Calloways had any of what they have now, he said at last. She and her husband settled the North Ridge in the early 1850s. Good land, good timber. Her husband died young, but she stayed. Raised her son alone up there. He paused. The Calloways wanted that land. They found ways to make it difficult for her. Legal ways, mostly. The kind of difficulty that leaves no marks. And her son? Percy looked at the floor. Daniel Voss died in 1874. He was 22 years old. He fell from the ridge during a confrontation with Gerald Calloway's men over a boundary fence. He said it flatly, the way people say things they have repeated so many times the emotion has worn smooth. The county ruled it an accident. Gerald Calloway was on the county commission at the time. Elias said nothing. He let the silence do the work. After that, Percy continued, Maren didn't leave the ridge much. People said she'd gone strange with grief, said things about her, the way people say things when they're frightened of something they can't name and they need the fear to have a shape. He looked up. But she wasn't strange. She was just a woman who had lost everything and understood very clearly who had taken it from her, and she never stopped watching them, never stopped waiting. Waiting for what? Percy met his eyes. For what comes, he said simply, when men like that spend 40 years making enemies and finally run out of room to hide from the consequences. That evening, Elias sat alone at the corner table in Gideon's, the 3 case files spread before him in the lamplight. He read each one a 4th time, slowly, looking not for facts but for shapes, the invisible architecture of what had been left out, the negative space of an investigation deliberately kept shallow. Josiah Holt, land dispute with the Calloway family. Dead at the base of a ravine. Ruled accidental. Clara Fitch, wife of Thomas Calloway's closest associate. Dead in her home. Cause undetermined, quickly closed. Robert Pruitt, school teacher, new to Black Hollow. Had been, according to a single brief handwritten note tucked into the back of his file, asking questions about the town's history and the Voss land matter. Dead in the woods, ruled exposure. 3 people, 3 different circumstances, but each one had been in some way pulling at the same thread. The long, unresolved thread that ran from the North Ridge down through 40 years of Calloway influence and emerged in the present as 3 bodies and a town that had learned, through long practice, to look away. Elias closed the files and looked out the frost-rimmed window. The North Ridge was a dark mass against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky, and in a single window of what he understood must be Maren Voss's house, a lamp burned, steady, unmoving, patient. He thought about Percy's words. A woman who had lost everything and understood very clearly who had taken it from her. The town called her the Woman of Darkness, spoke her name in lowered voices, attributed to her a power that no single person actually possessed. The power to cause, by will or malice or some unnamed force, the misfortunes that had accumulated around Black Hollow like weather. It was easier, Elias understood, to believe in a curse than to believe in 40 years of institutional corruption, deliberate cruelty, and the slow, grinding machinery of men protecting their own interests at the expense of everyone beneath them. Maren Voss hadn't cast a spell on Black Hollow. Black Hollow had cast a spell on itself. And the spell, the real one, the one that had kept everyone silent and compliant and looking away for 4 decades, was simply this: the belief that nothing could change, that the Calloways were permanent as the ridge itself, and that anyone who tried to say otherwise would end up like Josiah Holt, like Clara Fitch, like Robert Pruitt. That was the spell no one had dared to break. Elias gathered his files, folded them carefully, and placed them inside his coat. Tomorrow, he decided, he would go up the North Ridge. He would speak to Maren Voss. The morning came grey and hard, the kind of February morning that offered light without warmth, as though the sun had risen purely out of obligation. Elias ate breakfast alone at Gideon's, black coffee, cornbread, and the particular silence of a room where everyone present was carefully pretending not to watch him. Owen Tate moved behind the bar with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned long ago that the safest posture in Black Hollow was one of absolute neutrality. Elias finished his coffee, buttoned his coat, and walked out into the cold. The road to the North Ridge began at the far end of the main street, just past the padlocked schoolhouse, and climbed steeply into the pines through a series of switchbacks that made the ascent deceptive. It looked manageable from below and revealed its true difficulty only after the first quarter mile, when the grade sharpened and the trees closed in on either side, cutting off the view of the settlement below. He walked steadily, his boots crunching through the frozen crust of the path. The woods up here were different from the valley, older, denser, the kind of timber that had never been cleared because no one had found it worth the effort, or had understood, perhaps instinctively, that some places preferred to be left alone. The pines gave way gradually to bare-limbed oaks and chestnuts, their branches interlocked overhead, and through the gaps in the canopy, the sky showed itself in pale, irregular fragments. After 40 minutes of climbing, the path leveled briefly onto a narrow shelf of land, and Elias saw the house. It was smaller than he had imagined, a sturdy cabin of hewn timber, with a stone chimney from which a thin thread of smoke rose vertically in the windless cold, a woodpile stacked with precise economy against the south wall, a kitchen garden, dormant and brown now, enclosed by a low fence. 2 windows facing the valley below, their glass clouded with age. The house had the quality of something that had been maintained with great care under difficult circumstances, not prosperous, but not defeated either. It was the house of someone who intended to stay. Maren Voss was standing on the porch. She had seen him coming, had been watching him, he suspected, for the last 10 minutes of his climb. She stood with her arms at her sides, dressed as she had been the day before. Black coat, black bonnet, grey hair pinned back with the same severe precision. In the daylight and at close range, she was older than he had estimated, closer to 70 than 60, her face deeply lined, her hands visible now at her sides, the hands of someone who had spent decades working alone. But her eyes, dark brown and completely steady, held none of the uncertainty of old age. They held the concentrated stillness of someone who had been waiting for a very specific moment and recognized it when it arrived. "Mr. Drummond," she said. Her voice was low and even, carrying no particular warmth, but no hostility either. Elias stopped at the base of the porch steps. "Mrs. Voss, you know who I am." "I knew you were coming before you arrived," she said. "Word travels here, even when people pretend it doesn't." She studied him for a moment. "You'd better come inside. It's cold, and what I have to say will take some time." The interior of the cabin was spare and clean. A stone fireplace occupied most of the north wall, and a good fire burned in it, filling the room with a dry, resinous warmth. A table, 2 chairs, a shelf of books, a narrow bed behind a curtain at the far end, the accumulated possessions of a life stripped down to what was necessary and nothing more. On the table, a tin cup of tea sat cooling beside a stack of papers held down by a smooth river stone. Maren sat across from him at the table and folded her hands before her with the composure of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in her mind many times and had decided finally that the time for rehearsal was over. "You've been to Percy Gill," she said. It wasn't a question, among others. "Then you know the broad shape of it. The land, my husband, Daniel. She said her son's name without flinching, in the way that people say the names of the dead. They have grieved so completely that the grief has become structural, part of the architecture of who they are, rather than something that still breaks them open. What Percy didn't tell you, because he doesn't know all of it, is what happened after. Elias took out his notebook. Tell me. Maren looked at the notebook, then at him. You can put that away, she said. I'll tell you what happened. But I won't be a document. I've been a document long enough. In their land records, their commission rulings, their accident reports. I'll talk to you as a person, and you'll listen as one. And then you can decide what to do with what you hear. Elias closed the notebook and set it on the table between them. He left it there, visible, as a compromise. She nodded slightly and began. She had come to the ridge in 1851 with her husband, Willem Voss, a carpenter from Pennsylvania, who had read about Missouri land grants in a newspaper and believed, with the uncomplicated optimism of a young man in a new country, that a man could build something lasting if he chose the right ground and worked it honestly. They had chosen the North Ridge because it was remote, and because the timber was good, and because no one else had claimed it yet, which should have told them something, she said, but didn't. Willem had died of fever in the winter of 1858, leaving Maren alone with Daniel, who was 6 years old. She had not gone back east. There was nothing to go back to. Her own family was gone. Willem's family was distant and not particularly interested in a widowed daughter-in-law and her child. So she had stayed on the ridge and worked the land and raised her son, and for a period of roughly 15 years had managed a life that was hard but sufficient. The Callaways had arrived in Black Hollow in the mid-1860s, Gerald first, then his brothers, drawn by the mill opportunity and the timber contracts that the post-war years had opened up. Gerald Callaway was, Maren said, a man of considerable intelligence and negligible conscience, which in her experience was the most dangerous combination a person could possess. He understood systems, legal systems, financial systems, social systems, and he understood how to use them with precision to accomplish ends that cruder men would have pursued with direct violence. He never threatened me, Maren said. Not once in 20 years. He was too careful for that. Instead, he had Harrison, his brother on the land commission, adjust the recorded boundary of my property by 60 feet on the eastern side. Small enough that most people wouldn't notice. Significant enough that it cut off my access to the creek. She paused. Without the creek, I couldn't water the garden or the animals through the dry months. He knew that. He'd studied the land before he made his move. Elias said nothing. He watched her face. I filed a protest with the commission, she continued. Harrison sat on the commission. The protest was dismissed. I hired a lawyer from Rolla, spent most of what I had saved. The lawyer came, looked at the records, and told me the documentation was clean. There was nothing he could do. She looked at her hands on the table. The documentation was clean because Harrison had made it clean. That's what Gerald understood. If you control the records, you control reality. Whatever the records say happened, happened. Whatever they say didn't happen, didn't. Over the following years, the boundary adjustments continued in small increments, each one individually defensible, each one part of a pattern that was unmistakable to anyone looking at the whole, but nearly impossible to challenge in any single instance. Maren had protested each one, had been dismissed each time, had watched the legal costs consume what remained of her savings, had eventually reached the point where she had no resources left to fight with, and understood that this, precisely, had been the intended outcome. Daniel was a young man by then, she said. 21, 22. He was... She stopped, looked at the fire. When she continued, her voice had not changed in volume, but had changed in some quality that Elias couldn't name, become denser, perhaps, more weighted. He was a good young man, better than the situation deserved. He had his father's belief that things could be resolved fairly if you approached them honestly. He went to Gerald Calloway's men directly in the spring of 1874 to discuss the fence line on the eastern boundary. He went alone. He told me he was going. I told him not to. She paused. He went anyway. She was quiet for a long moment. They found him at the base of the ridge that afternoon, she said. The county said he had fallen. Gerald Calloway said his men had no knowledge of any meeting. There were no witnesses. Or rather, there were no witnesses willing to speak. She looked at Elias directly. You understand that distinction, Mr. Drummond? There is a great deal of difference between no witnesses and no witnesses willing to speak. I understand it, Elias said quietly. After Daniel died, Maren continued, I had nothing left to lose, which is a terrible thing to become, but it is also, in its way, a kind of freedom. I stopped filing protests. I stopped hiring lawyers. I stopped approaching the commission or the county or anyone who operated within a system that Gerald Calloway had already thoroughly arranged to his own benefit. She straightened in her chair. Instead, I watched. I kept records of my own. Every boundary adjustment, every commission ruling, every transaction involving Calloway land or Calloway interests. I wrote it all down, every detail I could gather, for 18 years. I talked to people, quietly, carefully, who had been similarly treated. There were more than people knew. The Calloways had not limited their methods to me. She reached across the table and lifted the river stone from the stack of papers beside her tea. She slid the stack toward Elias. Josiah Holt came to me 14 months ago, she said. He had found something. A set of original survey documents from the 1860s, before Harrison joined the commission, that showed the true boundary lines for 6 properties, including mine and his. Documents that proved, unambiguously, that the commission records had been falsified. She tapped the stack of papers with one finger. He brought them to me because he didn't know what else to do with them, and he didn't trust anyone in the valley. We were building a case together, a real one with documentation to take to the state commission in Jefferson City, above the county level, above Gerald Calloway's reach. And then Josiah died, Elias said. 3 weeks after he brought me those documents, Maren said. Found at the base of a ravine on his own land. A ravine he had walked past every day of his adult life. She looked at Elias steadily. Josiah Holt did not fall, Mr. Drummond. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the wind had come up, moving through the bare oak branches with a low, continuous sound. Clara Fitch, Elias said. Maren's expression shifted. Not softening exactly, but taking on a different quality, something closer to sorrow. Clara was Thomas Fitch's wife. Thomas is Gerald's cousin by marriage, part of the Calloway circle, though not a Calloway himself. Clara had grown unhappy with what she knew. She had heard things in that household over many years, conversations, arrangements, names. She had begun, quietly, to write things down herself. Maren paused. She made the mistake of confiding in her husband. Thomas Fitch was a weak man in the specific way that makes weak men dangerous. He was loyal to whoever frightened him most, he told Gerald. And Robert Pruitt? Elias asked. Robert was a careful young man, Maren said. Too careful for his own safety in the end. He had been asking questions about the town's history with the students' families, drawing out stories about the land disputes, the commission rulings, the pattern of it. He had been corresponding with a newspaper editor in St. Louis. I don't know exactly what he had sent or what he had found beyond what I knew myself. But someone knew he was asking. She folded her hands again on the table and looked at Elias with an expression of absolute composure that he recognized, now, for what it actually was. Not coldness, but the carefully maintained discipline of someone who had not permitted herself to come apart for 40 years, because coming apart was a luxury that her situation had never allowed. "I am 71 years old," she said. "I have lived on this ridge for 40 years since Daniel died. The town believes I am something to be feared. A woman made strange by grief and isolation, a source of misfortune, a darkness. I have not corrected that belief because it has kept Gerald Calloway's men from coming up here to finish what they started with Josiah and Clara and Robert." She met his eyes. "But I am not darkness, Mr. Drummond. I am a record, 40 years of documentation, carefully maintained, waiting for someone with the authority and the will to use it." She looked at the stack of papers between them. "The question," she said, "is whether you are that person." Elias sat with the papers for 2 hours at Marin's table, while she moved quietly around the cabin, tending the fire and preparing food with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had long since made peace with solitude. He read through the documents methodically. The original survey records Josiah had found, Marin's 18 years of compiled notations, the names and dates and transactions, the pattern that emerged from the accumulation of detail, the way a face emerges from a composite of features. It was meticulous, it was thorough, and it was, in his professional assessment, more than sufficient. What he was looking at was not the work of a woman made strange by grief. It was the work of someone who had understood, very early, that the only weapon available to her was patience, the willingness to accumulate evidence over decades when every other avenue had been closed, to maintain records with perfect discipline when everyone around her had decided that the Calloways were permanent and immovable, and that looking directly at what they had done was simply not worth the cost. He closed the last document and looked up. Marin was standing at the window, looking down toward the valley where the smoke from Black Hollow's chimneys rose in thin columns against the gray sky. "You said Pruitt was corresponding with an editor in St. Louis," Elias said. "A man named Harlan Webb at the Missouri Examiner," she said without turning from the window. "I have his address. Robert gave it to me before—" She stopped, resumed. "Before November." Elias stood and gathered the documents carefully, squaring the edges. "I'm going to need to take these to Jefferson City, to the State Commission and the Attorney General's office. This goes above what I'm authorized to handle alone." Marin turned from the window. She looked at the documents in his hands, 40 years of her life, the record of everything that had been taken from her, with an expression he could not quite read. Not reluctance, something more complex than that. The expression of someone releasing something they had held for so long that the holding had become indistinguishable from themselves. "I made copies," she said quietly. "Years ago. They're with a solicitor in Rolla, sealed, with instructions to open them if anything happens to me." She paused. "I'm not a fool, Mr. Drummond. I have survived 40 years in this valley by not being a fool." "No," Elias said. "You're not." He buttoned his coat and gathered the documents inside it, close against his chest. At the door, he turned back. "The town calls you the Woman of Darkness," he said. Marin Voss looked at him from across the room, small and old and absolutely unbowed, with the fire behind her and 40 years of solitary endurance in her eyes. "The town," she said, "calls anything it doesn't understand by a name that makes it easier to ignore." She turned back to the window. "Go do what you came here to do, Mr. Drummond. I'll be here when you need me." He walked out into the cold. Behind him, the door of the cabin closed quietly, and the smoke from the chimney continued to rise, straight and steady, into the pale February sky. Elias came down from the ridge in the early afternoon, the documents pressed flat against his chest beneath his coat, his mind working through the architecture of what Marin had given him. The path down was easier than the climb, but required more attention. The frost had softened slightly in the midday hours, and the trail was slick in places, the kind of treacherous that announced itself only after the foot had already committed. He was halfway down when he heard the horse. It came from below, moving up the path toward him, unhurried. The sound of hooves on frozen ground carrying clearly through the still air. Elias stepped to the side of the path and waited. A moment later, a rider came around the lower switchback and pulled up sharply at the sight of him. The man was perhaps 50, broad through the shoulders, with the ruddy, weathered complexion of someone who spent his life outdoors by choice rather than necessity. He was well dressed for Black Hollow. Good wool coat, good boots, a horse that was noticeably better fed and better kept than the animals Elias had seen tied outside Gideon's. He looked at Elias with an expression that arranged itself into friendliness a half-second too slowly. "You'd be the county man," the rider said. "Elias Drummond," Elias confirmed. He did not move from the center of the path. "Gerald Calloway." The man touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, a gesture that managed to suggest both courtesy and condescension simultaneously. "I heard you'd arrived. Thought I'd come introduce myself, seeing as I'm the closest thing this settlement has to a civic leader." He looked past Elias up the path, then back down. "You've been up to see Maren Voss." It was not a question. The calculation behind it was visible for just a moment, before Gerald Calloway's expression of amiable concern reasserted itself. "I have," Elias said. Gerald settled back in his saddle. "I hope she was helpful to you." "She's a troubled woman, Mr. Drummond. Has been for many years. The loss of her son affected her deeply. Understandably so. But grief can do things to a person's relationship with the truth, if you understand me. Can cause them to construct narratives that give the grief a place to live." He shook his head with what appeared to be sincere regret. "She's blamed my family for Daniel's death for nearly 20 years. It's a painful thing to be on the receiving end of, and I've tried to respond to it with patience and Christian charity. But I want you to be aware that anything she's told you about the Calloways should be understood in that context." Elias looked at him for a long moment. "I appreciate the context," he said pleasantly. "I'll be sure to weigh it carefully alongside the documentary evidence." Something moved behind Gerald Calloway's eyes, brief, controlled, immediately suppressed. "Documentary evidence," he repeated. "Land records, survey documents, commission rulings going back to 1863. Elias watched the man's face with the same patient attention he gave to everything. "Standard investigative process. I'm sure you understand." Gerald Calloway looked at him steadily for 3 full seconds. Then he smiled, a smile that reached every part of his face except his eyes. "Of course," he said. "If there's anything my family can do to assist your investigation, Mr. Drummond, you need only ask. We have nothing to hide, and every interest in seeing the truth come out." He touched his hat brim again. "Good afternoon." He turned his horse back down the path. Elias watched him go until the sound of hooves faded into the trees below. Then he stood very still for a moment, one hand pressed flat against his chest where the documents rested, and understood with complete clarity that he had perhaps 12 hours, possibly less, before Gerald Calloway made a decision about what to do next. He went directly to Gideon's, bypassing the main street, and found Owen Tate alone in the bar, preparing for the evening. Elias sat down across from him and spoke quietly and without preamble. "Gerald Calloway knows I've been up to see Maren Voss. He knew before I came back down. Someone told him I was going up there this morning." Owen Tate set down the bottle he was holding and looked at the table. "I didn't say anything," he said. "I believe you, but someone did." Elias leaned forward. "Owen, I need to know. Is there anyone in this town I can trust completely? Not just someone who resents the Calloways privately, someone who will act." Owen was quiet for a long time. The fire in the corner grate popped and settled. Outside, the light was failing, the short February afternoon collapsing toward darkness. "Nora Holt," he said at last. "Josiah's widow. She knows what happened to her husband. She's been quiet about it because she has 2 children and nowhere to go. But she knows." He paused. "And there's Walt Greer. He runs the farrier shop at the south end. Gerald tried to buy his property 3 years ago, and Walt refused. There have been difficulties between them since. Walt is not a man who frightens easily. I need to speak to both of them. Tonight, if possible. Quietly." Owen looked at him. "You're moving fast." "I have to," Elias said. "The man I met on the path this afternoon is not going to wait to see what I do. He's going to act first if he can." Nora Holt lived in a farmhouse at the northern edge of the settlement, set back from the road behind a fence that Josiah had built and that she maintained now with the same stubborn pride that she brought to everything in her life since his death. She was 38 years old, dark-haired, with a directness in her manner that had survived 14 months of grief and isolation without becoming bitterness. She opened the door before Elias knocked. She had seen him coming up the road and looked at him for a moment without speaking. "You've been up to see Maren," she said. "Is it that obvious?" "You have the look of someone who's just had everything they suspected confirmed," Nora said. "Come in." Inside, 2 children, a boy of perhaps 12 and a girl a few years younger, sat at a table doing schoolwork by lamplight. Nora sent them to the back room with a word and a look, then turned to Elias and sat down. She told him everything she knew in the precise, organized manner of someone who had been holding it ready for a very long time. Josiah had found the original survey documents in a deed box that had belonged to his father, documents his father had put away in the 1860s and apparently never spoken of, perhaps because he too had calculated the cost of speaking and found it prohibitive. When Josiah had understood what they meant, he had gone first to Maren because Maren was the one person in Black Hollow who had been fighting the Callaways long enough to understand the significance. "He came home that night," Nora said, "and he was lit up, the way he used to get when he believed in something. He said it was finally enough, that they could finally do something." She looked at her hands. 3 weeks later, he was dead. Were there any signs in those 3 weeks that he was being watched, followed? Any interactions with Callaway's men? Nora thought carefully. "A man came to the farm," she said. "Said he was from the county assessor's office, wanted to look at the property records. Josiah let him in." The man looked through the deed box. She paused. He would have seen that the original survey documents were gone. Elias absorbed this. "Nora, I need to ask you something directly. The documents Josiah found, do you know if he made copies before giving them to Maren?" "He did," she said immediately. "Josiah was careful. He made 2 copies, one for Maren, one he kept in the lining of his winter coat." She stood and crossed to a closet near the door, reached to the back shelf, and brought down a folded coat that she laid on the table. "I haven't touched it since he died. I didn't know what to do with it, but I've known it was there." She unfolded the coat, found the seam in the lining, and drew out a folded set of papers, thin with age, covered in careful handwriting. Elias looked at them. Then he looked at Nora Holt, who was watching him with an expression that contained grief and determination in equal measure. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to Jefferson City," he said. "But not tonight. Tonight I need to make sure these documents are safe and that Gerald Callaway doesn't know what I'm carrying when I leave." He folded Josiah's copies carefully. "Is there someone outside of Black Hollow, family, a friend in another town, who you trust?" "My sister in Rolla. Can you get word to her tonight? I need someone outside this valley to be holding a copy of everything by tomorrow morning." Nora looked at him steadily. "My boy rides fast," she said. "He knows the night road to Rolla. He's done it before. Then send him, Elias said. Tonight. Walt Greer was a large, unhurried man who spoke in the economical style of someone who had decided early in life that most words were unnecessary and had never found reason to revise that position. He listened to Elias in his farrier shop, standing with his arms crossed and his back to the forge, his face unreadable in the orange light. When Elias finished, Walt was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you need from me?" "If anything happens to me before I can leave tomorrow morning," Elias said, "I need someone who will get word to the State Attorney General's office in Jefferson City. I'll give you a name, a man I trust there. You send him a message that says, 'Drummond has found sufficient grounds and is delayed.' He'll know what to do." Walt uncrossed his arms. "And if nothing happens to you?" "Then I ride out at first light, and this becomes someone else's problem to solve from a level that Gerald Calloway can't reach." Walt considered this with the thoroughness of a man who did not make decisions hastily. "All right," he said finally. "I'll be up at first light. I'll watch the road." Elias offered his hand. Walt shook it once, firmly, and returned to his forge. Back at Gideon's, Elias ate supper alone and then sat by the window of his room on the upper floor, watching the street below. The settlement had gone quiet. It went quiet early, Black Hollow, as though darkness brought with it a collective agreement to reduce visibility. Lamps burned in a few windows, but the street itself was empty. At some point after 9 o'clock, he saw a rider leave from the direction of the Calloway mill and head south down the road at a pace that was not quite urgent, but was considerably faster than casual. A message being sent, he thought. To someone, somewhere, arranging something. He moved the documents from inside his coat to the bottom of his travel bag, beneath a change of clothes and his shaving kit. He sat in the chair by the door with his coat still on, and did not sleep. Outside, the temperature dropped steadily through the night, and Black Hollow lay still and dark and silent beneath the Appalachian ridgeline, holding, as it had held for 40 years, all the things that no one had found it safe enough to say. Elias was awake before dawn. He dressed in the dark, packed his bag methodically, and checked the documents one final time before replacing them at the bottom beneath his other belongings. Through the window, the sky was the particular deep blue that precedes first light. Not quite night, not yet morning, a threshold color that offered no certainty about what it would become. He came downstairs to find Owen Tate already behind the bar, building the morning fire. Owen looked at him without surprise. "Coffee's not ready yet," he said. "That's all right." Elias set his bag down. "A rider left the Calloway mill last night around 9, South Road. Do you know where that road goes?" Owen fed a piece of wood to the fire. "South Road to Hartwell. There's a telegraph office in Hartwell." A telegraph, faster than a rider. Which meant that whatever Gerald Calloway had decided, the decision had already been communicated, and the response, if any was coming, had been set in motion before midnight. "Is there anyone between here and Hartwell?" Elias asked. "Any settlement? Any farm on the road?" "Couple of farms. Brennan's place is about 6 miles out." Brennan worked for the Calloways. Owen was quiet for just a moment too long. "He leases his land from Gerald," he said. Elias picked up his bag. The coffee could wait. He found Walt Greer already at the stable, as promised, saddling Elias's horse with the calm efficiency of a man who had decided to do a thing and was doing it without fanfare. The sky was lightening in the east, a thin, cold line of pale gray above the ridge. "Rider went south last night," Elias said. "Telegraph to Hartwell. Someone may be waiting on the road." Walt tightened the saddle cinch without looking up. "Brennan's farm," he said. That's what Owen thought. Walt was quiet for a moment. Then he led a second horse from the stall, his own already saddled. "I'll ride with you to the county line," he said. 6 miles past Brennan's. After that, you're in open country, and you'll be all right. Elias looked at him. You don't have to do that. No, Walt agreed. He handed Elias the reins to his horse. I don't. They rode out of Black Hollow in the gray pre-dawn light, south down the road, their breath and the horse's breath rising together in the cold air. The settlement fell away behind them, the mill, the church, the dark outline of the schoolhouse, and the road entered a long, straight corridor of bare-limbed trees that closed off the view on either side. They rode in silence. Walt rode slightly ahead, his posture easy, his eyes on the road, with the relaxed attention of someone who knew this terrain and knew how to read it. 4 miles out, he raised one hand, and they stopped. Ahead, where the road curved left around a stand of dead elms, a fire burned in a clearing just off the road. A small fire, the kind built for warmth during a wait rather than for cooking. 2 horses were tied to a fence post at the edge of the clearing. One man sat by the fire. Another stood at the road's edge, watching their approach. The standing man was large, considerably larger than either Elias or Walt, and he held his position in the center of the road with the unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to being an obstacle that people found it easier to go around. Drummond, the man said, as they came within speaking distance. His voice was flat and without particular inflection. Gerald Calloway wants to speak with you before you leave the county. Gerald Calloway had the opportunity to speak with me yesterday, Elias said, on the path down from the ridge. He said everything he needed to say. He has more to say. I'm sure he does. Elias kept his voice even. But I'm a county officer in the execution of an official investigation. Impeding my travel constitutes obstruction of county business, which is a criminal matter. He looked at the man steadily. I'd encourage you to think carefully about whether Gerald Calloway's interests are worth a criminal charge. The man by the fire had stood up and moved to the road. 2 of them now, blocking the road, watching Elias with the flat patience of men who had been paid to do a thing and had decided the payment was sufficient. Walt Greer said nothing. He simply moved his horse forward until it stood alongside Elias's, its shoulder almost touching the large man's in the road, and looked down at him from the saddle with the complete, unhurried calm of someone who had made a calculation and found the result satisfactory. The large man looked up at Walt. Walt said nothing. He simply waited. The silence stretched. The fire crackled. Then the large man stepped back half a pace, not dramatically, not as a concession he was willing to acknowledge, but enough. His companion at the fire looked at him, and some unspoken negotiation passed between them. Gerald will hear you left, the large man said to Elias. Gerald will hear a great deal more than that, Elias said, before this is finished. He clicked his horse forward. Walt followed. The 2 men watched them pass and did not move to stop them. They rode without speaking until the Brennan farm was out of sight behind them, and the road opened onto wider, flatter country where the trees fell back and the sky expanded overhead, pale and cold and enormous. Thank you, Elias said. Walt shrugged with one shoulder. Send word from Jefferson City when it's done, he said. Black Hollow will want to know. At the county line, marked by nothing more than a weathered post, driven into the frozen ground at the road's edge, Walt pulled up his horse and stopped. Elias rode on a few paces, then turned back. Why did he step back? Elias asked. The man in the road. He had every advantage. Walt looked at him. Because I was there, he said simply. A county man alone on a road can disappear. A county man and a local witness is a different matter. He turned his horse. That's all it was. Arithmetic. He rode back north toward Black Hollow without looking back. Elias watched him go for a moment. Then he turned south and rode hard toward Jefferson City. He arrived in Jefferson City on the second evening, cold through and tired in the specific way of a man who has not permitted himself to stop thinking for 36 hours. He went directly to the offices of the State Attorney General, a man named Caleb Morris, whom Elias had worked with twice before, and trusted with the particular careful trust that professional experience earns over time. Morris was still at his desk when Elias arrived, which was either fortunate or a testament to the man's work habits. He looked up from his papers, took in Elias's appearance, the frost still in his coat, the travel bag held close, and gestured to the chair across his desk without preamble. Elias sat down, opened his bag, and laid the documents on the desk. He talked for 2 hours. Morris listened without interruption, a quality that Elias had always found remarkable in him, the ability to receive information without inserting himself into it, to let a story arrive at its own pace and in its own shape before beginning to assess it. He looked at each document as Elias referenced it, held certain ones under the lamp for closer examination, set them down in a careful order that suggested he was already organizing them into the structure of a legal proceeding. When Elias finished, Morris sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. 40 years, he said. From 1863 to now, Elias said. Possibly earlier. 3 deaths. Possibly more if you look further back. I focused on the 3 most recent, because the evidence is strongest there. Morris looked at the documents again. The original survey records are the center of it. If these are authenticated, and I'll need a land surveyor and a document examiner to confirm, then the commission records are demonstrably falsified. That's fraud. If we can connect the fraud to the deaths. The death of Josiah Holt happened 3 weeks after he found those documents and shared them with Maren Voss, Elias said. And Gerald Calloway knew Josiah had found them. Someone from his office examined the deed box on the Holt property in the weeks before Josiah died. That's circumstantial. It's a start, Elias said. And there's more. Clara Fitch had been keeping her own records of what she'd heard in the Calloway household. Her husband told Gerald what she'd been doing. She died 2 months later. He leaned forward. Caleb, I need subpoenas for the county commission records going back to 1863. I need an investigation of the Holt, Fitch, and Pruitt deaths that operates outside the county level. Those investigations were deliberately inadequate, and at least one of the physicians involved has since relocated under circumstances that should be examined. And I need someone to go back to Black Hollow with authority, because the people there who are willing to speak cannot be left exposed. Morris nodded slowly. He picked up a pen and began to write. The following days moved with the deliberate momentum of institutional machinery that has been set in motion and cannot easily be stopped. Morris was thorough, and more importantly, he was angry in the controlled, purposeful way that made him effective. Not the anger that makes men rash, but the anger that makes them persistent. Subpoenas were drafted. A state land surveyor was dispatched to examine and authenticate the original survey documents. A separate investigator was assigned to re-examine the 3 deaths, working above the county level. Elias filed his official report, 40 pages, documented, cross-referenced, the most complete account he had ever written, and delivered it to Morris's office, to the State Commission, and to Harlan Webb, at the Missouri Examiner in St. Louis, whose name Maren had given him, and who, it turned out, had already received 3 letters from Robert Pruitt and had been waiting, with mounting unease, for a 4th that never came. On the 4th day, Elias sent 2 messages. One to Walt Greer at his farrier shop in Black Hollow. Matter is in official hands. State level. Hold steady. The other to Maren Voss, addressed care of Percy Gill at the general store, since he had no confidence that a letter addressed directly to the North Ridge would arrive unexamined. The records have been received. The work you did for 40 years is doing exactly what you intended it to do. Hold on. He did not know if either message would arrive before events outpaced them. In Black Hollow, things had shifted. The morning after Elias's departure, Gerald Calloway had ridden through the main street with 2 of his men and stopped at Gideon's, where Owen Tate had told him, with perfect honesty because it was true, that he had no idea what documents Drummond had taken or what he had found. Gerald had then gone to the Holt farm, where Nora had told him, with a composure that surprised even herself, that she had nothing to say to him. He had gone to the North Ridge. Maren had seen him coming. She stood on her porch and watched him ride up the path with the same stillness she had shown Elias 3 days before, and when Gerald Calloway pulled up his horse at the base of her porch steps and looked at her, she looked back at him with an expression that told him, clearly and without any words at all, that whatever he had come to do, it was already too late. "You've made a mistake," Gerald said. "I've been making the same mistake for 40 years, Maren said. "Believing that the truth is worth more than the cost of telling it." She looked at him steadily. "You've spent 40 years believing the opposite. One of us has been right. We're about to find out which." Gerald Calloway looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the ridge without another word. It was, Percy Gill said later, the first time anyone in Black Hollow could remember Gerald Calloway leaving a conversation without the last word. Spring came to Black Hollow 6 weeks later, earlier than usual. A tentative, cautious spring that moved through the Appalachian hollows with the hesitant quality of something that wasn't entirely sure of its welcome. The ice on the creek broke up in early March with a sound like distant artillery, and the mud that followed was the deep, rich mud of ground that had been frozen hard and was now releasing everything it had held through the winter. By the time the mud dried, Black Hollow had changed. The State Commission's investigators had arrived in the 3rd week of February, 4 of them, with a surveyor and a document examiner, and the authority of the Attorney General's office written plainly on their credentials. They had set up in the schoolhouse, which was unlocked for the purpose, and worked with a thoroughness that the county investigations had conspicuously lacked. The original survey documents were authenticated within 2 days. The document examiner, a meticulous man from St. Louis who approached forgery with the absorbed enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved his work, confirmed what Maren's records had long suggested. The commission boundary adjustments dating back to 1863 had been recorded on documents that bore evidence of systematic alteration. The ink dates didn't match the paper ages. Certain entries had been made over erasures. The handwriting in key sections was consistent across decades in a way that natural variation should have prevented. Harrison Calloway, called to Jefferson City to answer questions before the State Commission, arrived with a lawyer and left the first session visibly shaken. He returned for the second session without his lawyer, having evidently decided that a different strategy was required, and proceeded to tell the Commission a story that contradicted, in several significant particulars, the story his lawyer had told on his behalf the day before. Gerald Calloway was a more disciplined subject. He answered every question precisely, offered nothing volunteered, and maintained throughout the entire proceeding the composed, faintly regretful demeanor of a man who has been the victim of a misunderstanding too complex to explain to people of limited patience. He was, Elias thought, watching from the back of the room, genuinely impressive in a way that made him more rather than less dangerous, the kind of man who could sit in a room full of evidence of what he had done and still make the people looking at the evidence feel slightly uncertain. But the documents were what they were. And 40 years of Maren Voss's meticulous notations, cross-referenced against the authenticated survey records, constructed a case that did not depend on Gerald Calloway's demeanor or anyone's uncertainty about anything. The State Commission ruled in March. The boundary adjustments from 1863 onward were voided. The original survey lines were reinstated. property that had been absorbed into Callaway Holdings through the falsified commission records. Maren's land, Josiah Holt's eastern acreage, 4 other properties belonging to families who had stopped protesting years ago because protesting had never worked, reverted to their original owners, or, in the case of owners who had died, to their heirs. Harrison Callaway was removed from the commission and indicted on charges of fraud and falsification of public records. The reinvestigation of the 3 deaths was more complex and moved more slowly, as such things do. Josiah Holt's death was reclassified as suspicious pending further investigation. Clara Fitch's case was reopened. The physician who had signed her death certificate was located in Kansas City and proved, under questioning, to have a financial relationship with Thomas Fitch that had not been previously disclosed. Robert Pruitt's case, with the letters he had sent to Harlan Webb at the Missouri Examiner entered into evidence, was referred to the state prosecutor's office. Gerald Callaway was not arrested that spring. The law moves carefully around powerful men, and Elias understood this without pleasure and without surprise. But the machinery was moving, and Gerald Callaway, who had spent 40 years arranging systems to protect himself, was discovering that the arrangement had a limit, that there was a level above the county commission's reach, and that Elias Drummond had found it and used it, and that Maren Voss had been building toward it for 4 decades with a patience that had finally, at the last possible hour, been vindicated. Elias returned to Black Hollow on a Wednesday in early April, riding north from Jefferson City with the commission's ruling in his bag and the particular tiredness of a man who has finished something that took more out of him than he had anticipated. The settlement looked different in the spring light, or perhaps it was the same, and he was looking at it differently, now that the weight of what it had been holding had shifted. The mill was running again, he noticed, fully, loudly, the wheel turning in the swollen creek with the sound of something recently unblocked. Percy Gill was outside his store, talking with a woman Elias didn't recognize, and he raised a hand as Elias rode past, in a gesture that was warmer than any acknowledgement he had offered in February. Owen Tate poured him a coffee without being asked, and set it on the bar with a look that said everything that Owen Tate's economy of expression was capable of conveying. "Walt Greer wants to see you," Owen said, "and Nora Holt. She asked every day if there'd been word." "There's word," Elias said. "Good word. Tell them this evening." He finished his coffee and rode to the North Ridge. The path up to Maren's cabin was different in April, muddy and soft, the trees beginning to bud, the light coming through at different angles now that the canopy was stirring back to life. Birds had returned to the ridge and moved through the branches with the busy purposefulness of creatures who had been elsewhere and were now reasserting their claim. Maren was in her kitchen garden when he arrived, crouched over a patch of turned earth at the south end of the fence, her hands dark with soil. She looked up at the sound of his horse and stayed where she was, watching him dismount and tie his horse to the fence post. He crossed to where she was kneeling and held out the commission's ruling, a formal document folded and sealed with the state seal, addressed to Maren Voss of the North Ridge, Black Hollow, Missouri. She looked at it without taking it for a moment. Then she took it from his hand, broke the seal, and unfolded it. She read it slowly, all the way through, while Elias stood in the mud of her kitchen garden and listened to the birds in the ridge timber, and waited. When she finished, she folded it again along its original creases. She was quiet for a long time. Around them, the early April wind moved through the new buds, with a sound that was nothing like the winter wind, lighter, unstable, full of a promise that had not yet decided exactly what it intended to keep. "The land," she said at last. "Reinstated to its original boundaries as of 1851, Elias said. "Yours, clear, with no further commission jurisdiction at the county level. Any future boundary questions go directly to the state." Maren looked at the document in her hands. Daniel would have been 62 years old this year, she said. Not as a wound reopened, but as a fact being set down in its proper place. Acknowledged, recorded, given its weight. Yes, Elias said. He never got to see the creek from the east side of the property. They took that access when he was 10 years old. She looked out over her garden toward the eastern slope, where the land fell away through birch trees toward the creek. He used to ask me why we didn't just go down there anyway, when he was small. I told him it wasn't ours anymore. She paused. I should have told him it wasn't theirs either. That there's a difference between what someone takes and what they own. Elias said nothing. Some things don't need a response. Maren stood up, brushing the soil from her hands and her knees, and straightened with the careful deliberateness of a 71-year-old body that had been kneeling too long. She looked at Elias with an expression that was not happiness exactly. Happiness seemed too simple a word for what 40 years of loss and 40 years of resistance and one April morning of vindication could produce in a person's face. It was something more like the expression of someone who has set down a weight they had carried so long they had stopped believing it was separate from themselves. The Callaways, she said. Harrison has been indicted. The 3 deaths are under active reinvestigation at the state level. Gerald, he paused. Gerald will take longer. Men like Gerald always take longer. But the documentation is in state hands now, and there is a newspaper in St. Louis that has a great deal of what Robert Pruitt sent them, and there is an attorney general who is angry in the particular way that produces results. He looked at her. It won't be undone. What you built over 40 years, it won't be undone. Maren nodded slowly. She looked at the document one more time, then folded it carefully and tucked it inside her coat, close against her chest. The same gesture, Elias realized, that he had used when he carried it down the ridge in February. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee. The real kind, not what Owen Tate serves." That evening, Elias sat with Walt Greer and Nora Holt and Owen Tate in Gideon's and told them everything. The commission ruling, the indictment, the reinvestigations, the newspaper involvement. Nora listened with her hands flat on the table and her eyes steady, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said simply, "Good." Just that word, with the entire weight of 14 months of grief and waiting behind it. Walt said nothing, as was his habit, but he raised his glass slightly before drinking, which from Walt was the equivalent of a considerable speech. Percy Gill had come in halfway through and stood at the bar listening. "What happens to Black Hollow now?" he asked when Elias finished. Elias looked around the room, at the people who had lived for 40 years, inside the particular silence that power and fear construct when they work together over a long time. "The mill keeps running," he said,